For our live example, please open up the Stochastics notebook located in the course content folder. In this, it will feel very similar to our last few calls, so we're going to try to go through this at a little bit more of an accelerated rate, explaining what's happening, reviewing once we're able to run it, and then with that we'll jump into the next section where we're actually going to take all three of our metrics that we've calculated and create a potential trading strategy. Not one I'd recommend you using, but one that can give you the gist of how to use these in conjunction to make a complete strategy and train your model for our future dashboard. So as with our last examples, we're going to start by importing our Y Finance module. From there, we're going to define our stochastics calculation that is going to have three inputs. With our last, with our first one, we had something that was a number and a close value. With our last one, we just had a close value, and now we're going to pass three different data frame columns into, or as the inputs into our stochastics function here. To calculate the stochastics, we are going to calculate a rolling average of the high values, so a rolling high of, or a rolling max of the last 14 values, a rolling low of the last 14, and then we're going to utilize those throughout each of the close columns and do math with the the close minus the low 14 value we created over the high 14 minus the low 14 multiplied by 100 to calculate that %K. So we're going to, for each item inside of the close, high, low, calculate each of these values to get the %K. And then on the D, for %D, we're going to very simply take a rolling 3 average to calculate that line and give you the values necessary to get the %D. So one thing I'll quickly note as we create these, if you don't see percents in front of these as the names for the variables, there's, with Python, the percent means something as far as the math function, so you cannot name your variable with a percent, starting with a percent, so I just called them K and D here for our simple example. But again, if you want more detail on this, I recommend going to Rune's site, as we talked about in the opening, or even simply going to Wikipedia, who has a very great explanation of the %D and %K calculations. From there, we're going to, as normal, call our Y Finance module to grab our 2 days worth of data at 1 minute intervals. Fix our text note here again for this example, but we're going to again call that data, and then down here we're going to, as in our last example, create 2 additional data frame columns that will be appended to our data frame that was created here, called the %K and the %D, and we will be doing that by calling our calc stochastics functions and passing it the high, low, and close values of our data frame. Alright, so let's run through this and talk about what it's doing, and then we'll run it and we'll talk about the output, or talk about it using the output. So again, in here, when we start this function, we're going to import Y Finance. We're not going to run anything with our function because it has not yet been called. We're going to first start our line of code, our execution here, with assigning AAPL to the data frame of the ticker, Apple ticker, over the last 2 days worth of data at 1 minute intervals. We are then going to create 2 new columns to append to our AAPL data frame called %K and %D that will be created by calling our stochastics function and passing it the AAPL high, low, and close columns. Once we pass these to this function for inputs of high, low, and close, and these values can be anything. If we haven't mentioned this in the past, keep in mind you can call these values whatever you'd like, as long as what you pass here is the right input of what you need here. I could call this, something crazy off the wall. Call it hand, foot, whatever you want to call it, right? As long as AAPL.high is your first and it corresponds to your high, AAPL is low and it corresponds to low, or whatever you call this middle variable, and then same with close is this last one. And then you use them in the corresponding ways you need to here. But basically just remember we're calling these three out of our data frame, grabbing these columns, passing them as the inputs to our function, and we are now going to calculate the high 14 utilizing our high, the low 14 utilizing our low, and then we're going to calculate K utilizing our close, our low 14, and our high 14 that were created all from our values that we imported to our function. We will then create our D utilizing a simple rolling average of our K, and we will return both the K and D values, all of these calculated values, to our columns of AAPL%K and AAPL%D. Remember, it's the order that's important, so we're returning K first, D second to our AAPL%K column and AAPL%D column. So let's go ahead and run it. With that, we'll execute our AAPL so that we can see what's down here and what was been created. So as usual, we've got our 2 days worth of data points for the open, high, low, close, volume, dividends, and stock splits from Y Finance. And now, since we have created 2 new columns with our function to calculate our %K and our %D values, these are now here as part of this function. So you now have the ability to plot these later and utilize these with our metrics. So again, when we did this, we created our function, called our data frame to grab our information from our date time over to our stock splits. So date time, open, high, low, close, volume, dividends, and stock splits. We used the high, low, and close columns of this existing data frame to call our function and create our 2 new %K and %D columns, which are located here and now appended to our data frame for further study. So I'm going to go ahead and clear our outputs, and as always, if you'd like to test it, feel free to run this. Drop a CSV file here in our course content folder. As again, if that test is open from a previous section, remember to close it or rename the test so that you are able to export this and create that for review. And as I always state, feel free to practice with this. Change the values here so that you can calculate, over 16 average, over a rolling 4 average. Make sure you understand how these values are being calculated. Play and tweak with the high, low, close. Again, it won't be stochastics if you use different values, but it doesn't hurt to just tweak it and try and see what's being passed. Make sure you understand the function call, understand, the order here, what values are being passed, how they're being called, how you're using them. But yeah, those are the important lessons. But again, feel free to play with it. You're not going to break it. Just don't forget to save it. And as of always, if you overwrite it, go to the course content folder, re-download it, and then just replace the stochastics piece here. So with that, let's go ahead and jump into our next section where we will now be utilizing a combination of our 3 metrics to create a potential trading strategy.